The old Toronto courthouse stood like a granite vault against a pale February sky. 2003. Snowflakes swirled around the stone columns and melted on the shoulders of the crowd pressing at the steps. Reporters clutched notepads, their breath rising in clouds. Camera shutters cracked like distant gunfire. Inside, the air smelled of varnish and cold dust. The high-ceilinged chamber hummed with the low electricity of anticipation. Families of the dead filled the benches, faces drawn, knuckles white around photographs of sons and daughters, lovers and friends. A row of plainclothes officers lined the rear wall, their eyes fixed forward. At the defense table sat Elara Voss and Liam Thorne, both 27. They looked like statues cut from opposing stone. Elara pale and still, dark hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to sharpen the angles of her face. Liam broad-shouldered, fingers tapping a slow, steady rhythm on the oak tabletop. Neither acknowledged the crowd. Neither spoke. The clerk rose and began to read the charges. Each count fell into the room like a hammer stroke. First-degree murder, 9 counts. Aggravated sexual assault, 5 counts. Kidnapping, armed robbery, arson causing death. Conspiracy to commit homicide. The words carried no ornament. They needed none. The litany traced a decade of brutality from Halifax to Vancouver. Couples vanished on winter highways, travelers found in burned cabins, families wiped away in the night. Forensic reports documented thefts and assaults, DNA linking the defendants again and again. Every province knew their names. Elara sat perfectly upright, gaze fixed on a patch of sunlight slanting across the far wall. Liam leaned back, eyelids half closed, a faint curl at the corner of his mouth. The tapping of his fingers never faltered. Justice Irene McAllister entered, black robes whispering against the worn carpet. The gallery rose, a single restless wave, then settled back into creaking wood. Cameras clicked, then stilled. No one in the chamber spoke as the judge opened the file that held nearly a decade of investigation. Photographs of crime scenes, autopsy summaries, statements from surviving witnesses, and the painstaking chain of evidence that tied each killing to the pair seated side by side. In the sterile language of law, the record detailed robberies that ended in death, assaults confirmed by forensic testing, and a trail of burned-out vehicles and blood-stained motel rooms stretching across the country. Outside the tall windows, snow drifted past like slow-moving ash. Inside, the silence thickened until even the scrape of a chair leg seemed too loud. Elara's thoughts slid backward through time, frosted alleys, sodium lamps, the smell of gasoline and cold iron. Liam's rhythm at her side matched the pulse of every highway they had ever taken. Every night they had outrun the sirens. The gavel fell once. The trial, years in the making, had reached its final morning. The duplex on Agricola Street hunched beneath a low Atlantic sky, its clapboard siding blistered by salt wind. Inside, winter seeped into the wallpaper and the smell of damp wood never left the rooms. Elara Voss was 19. Pale and fine-boned, she moved through school and part-time shifts at the laundromat like a shadow, never certain where to place her hands. 9 months earlier, her mother had invited Grant Willis to stay for a while. He arrived with a mechanic's grin and the quiet certainty of a man staking territory. Within weeks, the house belonged to him. At first it was small things, a slammed cupboard when dinner wasn't ready, a glance that lingered too long, the scrape of a chair pulled sharply across the kitchen floor. Then came the sudden backhand when she left the porch light burning, the grip on her wrist that left bruises shaped like fingerprints. Grant's rules multiplied, lights out by 10, no phone calls after dark, doors locked whether she was home or not. He policed her clothing, her friends, her every movement, his voice low and sharp enough to cut. When she told her mother, at first carefully, then in a rush of panic, Margaret's silence hardened into something worse than disbelief. "You're making trouble," her mother said without words, eyes fixed on the sink. Grant's presence filled the kitchen doorway, a quiet smirk under the humming fluorescent light. By late autumn, the house had shrunk to a handful of airless rooms. Nights brought the sound of his boots in the hallway, the sudden slam of a fist against the wall outside her bedroom. She learned to stay awake, heart hammering, until the floorboards went still. One evening in December, he cornered her near the stairwell, the smell of motor oil and cigarette smoke thick around him. His breath burned her ear as he whispered a string of threats. What he'd do if she ever spoke again, how easily he could make her disappear. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Winter deepened. Each day she returned from work to find something moved. A drawer slightly open, a pillow turned. She began to keep her few belongings in a single backpack, ready to leave at a moment's notice. On a rain-slick night, she finally moved. The house slept in the heavy dark of 3 a.m. She eased the door shut, the latch clicking like a gunshot in her ears. The backpack held $60, a worn novel, a cracked cassette player. No note, no forwarding address. Outside, the city was washed in sodium light, puddles reflecting the scattered neon of late-night diners and empty taxi stands. The bus station smelled of diesel and wet wool. When the eastbound coach pulled in, she climbed aboard without looking back. Halifax harbour stretched black and endless behind her, a void that felt like freedom. The bus hissed through pine-shadowed highways and half-asleep towns, Truro, Amherst, Moncton. Faces blurred behind rain-streaked glass, she slept in fits, waking to the groan of brakes and the smell of cold coffee. By the time she stepped onto the wet pavement outside Toronto's Union Station, December wind cut through her thin jacket like a blade. The city roared around her, lights, horns, the metallic clang of streetcars, a noise big enough to swallow her whole. Elsewhere in the city, a young man walked free for the first time in months. Liam Thorne, 20, carried a cigarette lighter and the echo of detention center walls. Foster homes had never held him. He knew alleys, freight yards, the quick lift of wallets and phones. A thin scar curved across his jaw like an unfinished sentence. Their paths would cross before winter ended. The city was a cold labyrinth of concrete and sodium light. Streetcars sparked against frozen rails, throwing brief showers of blue fire into the night. Elara moved through it with the quiet alertness of someone who had already learned to disappear. She slept the first week in the Greyhound terminal, wedged between a vending machine and a bolted plastic chair. The heat vents coughed dust and stale air. Each dawn the janitor's mop nudged her awake, and she drifted into the streets before anyone could ask questions. Food came from day-old bakeries and the back doors of restaurants where kitchen staff left unsold bread for anyone who knew the schedule. She wrapped herself in layers of thrift store wool and kept her head down. Liam Thorne drifted through the same winter, a figure of restless motion. 20 years old, born in a Toronto foster system that felt like a string of locked doors, he carried the city in his pockets. A bent bus token, a stolen lighter, 2 packs of cigarettes he'd lifted that morning. He'd been out of the Don jail only 6 weeks. Trespassing, shoplifting, a fight outside a convenience store that ended with broken glass and a scar along his jaw. None of it had slowed him. He liked the feel of streets at night, alleys slick with melting snow, the hush of train yards where no one asked his name. Liam knew how to spot someone who had nowhere to go. It was just after midnight when their paths crossed in the shadow of the viaduct. Elara had ducked under the overpass to escape a burst of freezing rain. Liam leaned against a concrete pillar, smoke curling from a cigarette, a paper bag of cheap wine at his feet. No words passed at first, only a glance that measured and recognized. 2 strays. He offered the bottle. She hesitated, then took a swallow, the cheap alcohol burning a trail of warmth. The bridge groaned overhead as a train rumbled past, shaking the ground beneath them. For the next hour they shared a silence that was almost conversation. Days blurred. They moved like shadows from Parkdale to Kensington Market, sharing half-eaten sandwiches and rooftop views. Liam showed her which alleys stayed unlocked, which subway entrances stayed open after hours. Small crimes paid for coffee and the occasional hot meal. A wallet lifted here, a cassette player there. The thrill of it came not from the money, barely enough for cigarettes, but from the sudden spike of adrenaline, the sharp taste of freedom. 2 months passed in a rhythm of cold nights and stolen mornings. February 1995 arrived with bitter wind and thin daylight. Elara noticed how easily they fell into step. His quick scan of a crowd matched hers, his laugh cut short the way hers did. Neither asked the other about past wounds. It was as if each understood the other carried rooms of silence too heavy to open. One night, crouched on the roof of a shuttered warehouse, she watched the city's neon shimmer on snow and felt something shift. Liam flicked his lighter, flame reflecting in his eyes, and for the first time in months, she felt the faint outline of belonging. Dangerous, magnetic. A pair of runaways orbiting the same dark star. The thaw came late that year. By April, the city streets were awash of dirty snowmelt and neon reflections. Liam and Elara had been together 3 months. Long enough for the city's hidden corners to feel like home, long enough for hunger and boredom to start pressing harder than the cold ever had. Their small crimes, wallets lifted on Queen Street, a shoplifted Walkman from the Eaton Centre, no longer delivered a rush. The adrenaline faded faster each time. They needed something bigger, something that would keep the noise in their heads quiet a little longer. Liam noticed the pawn shop first. A narrow storefront on Dundas, barred windows, an aging neon sign that flickered cash for gold in sputtering red. He'd sold a stolen radio there once and clocked the layout. One counter, a single security camera that whirred more slowly than it should. For a week they watched the shop. Afternoons were dead. The clerk, a heavy-set man named Rudy, maybe 50, spent most of them hunched over paperwork. No other staff. Elara took notes in a crumpled pocket journal. Back door opens to alley, camera angle wide but grainy, closing time 7 p.m. Every evening they rehearsed routes through the alleys, marking which dumpsters they could scale, which fences bent easiest. May 12, 1995. Elara was 21, Liam barely 20. A cold drizzle slicked the pavement. They dressed in layers of black, faces shadowed beneath thrift store hoodies. At 6:55, the last customer left. The neon sign buzzed and faltered. Through the front window, Rudy turned the open placard to closed. Liam pushed the door just before the lock clicked. Elara followed, heartbeat sharp enough to taste. Rudy looked up, startled. "We're—" Liam's fist connected before the sentence finished, the sound of impact flat and final. The man crumpled behind the counter. Elara vaulted the glass case and grabbed the till. Coins and bills spilled like a sudden storm. Liam swept rings and watches into a canvas bag, movements quick but almost calm. Rudy stirred, a groan rising. Liam froze, eyes meeting Elara's. A silent decision passed between them, something wordless and permanent. The next strike was harder. The pawnshop went still. They fled through rain-slick alleys, shoes splashing in cold puddles. Behind them, the pawnshop light guttered and died. In a boarded-up warehouse near the Gardiner Expressway, they dumped the bag's contents on the floor. A few $100s in cash, a scatter of gold bands, the metallic scent of blood still clinging to their clothes. Elara sat against the wall, chest heaving. The fear she expected never came. Instead, there was a strange rising clarity, a bright wire of energy running through her veins. Liam lit a cigarette with hands that didn't shake. "Easy," he whispered, almost to himself. Outside, sirens wailed distantly, swallowed by the hum of the expressway. In the weeks that followed, the pair moved like ghosts. They dyed their hair, switched thrift store jackets, and drifted through neighborhoods where no one knew their names. News of the pawnshop murder hit the Toronto Star 3 days later. Clark slain in Dundas robbery. Security footage was too grainy for identification, witnesses were few. Instead of fear, the headline brought a thrill. A proof that they could act and vanish. Summer came early, and with it a hunger neither of them bothered to name. Toronto sweated under a heavy June heat. Pavement shimmered, air conditioners rattled in apartment windows, and the city carried the tension of a place waiting for a storm. Elara and Liam lived in the margins, cheap motels by the hour, basements of friends, back seats of cars left unlocked. Their haul from the pawn shop was nearly gone, spent on bus tickets, food, and the occasional binge of beer and speed. The money was never the point, it was the current under their skin, the risk, the charge of vanishing after a headline. Detective Susan Carrow took the call the morning the Toronto Star ran its third piece on the pawnshop killing. 44, a decade in homicide, she had a knack for details. The angle of a bruise, the pattern of a footprint. The crime scene bothered her. No forced entry. Camera footage useless. The clerk's injuries suggested a burst of sudden violence, then precision. Someone who'd decided mid-robbery to end a life and leave clean. She compiled a list of recent petty offenders with escalating records, scanning for names that recurred. Liam Thorne's mugshot came across her desk twice, attached to older theft charges. A ghost of a lead. By late July, Elara and Liam sensed the city tightening. Unmarked cars lingered near familiar alleys. A man in plain clothes watched too long outside a diner. They packed what little they owned, a canvas bag of clothes, a tin of cash, a box of cassette tapes, and boarded a night bus headed west. 2 months, Liam murmured as the city lights thinned. That's all Toronto gets. Elara watched the skyline recede, feeling only relief. They drifted through small towns. Sudbury, Thunder Bay, Kenora. Each place left a thin trail of theft. Wallets, unattended cars, a break-in at a bait shop where the owner woke to find his safe emptied and his door splintered. August 1995 brought their second killing. Near Dryden, a couple traveling from Minnesota had parked overnight at an isolated rest area. Mark and Helen Carson, ages 28 and 26, newlyweds crossing Canada in a rust-colored camper van. Elara and Liam approached near dawn, the air still with mosquitoes and pine. What began as a simple robbery turned frantic when Helen screamed and Mark lunged forward. The scene ended quickly, brutally. By sunrise, the Carsons' van stood empty, doors ajar, morning light glinting off a smear of red on the gravel. Elara and Liam drove off in the couple's station wagon, the camper left behind like a discarded. Detective Carrow received word of the double homicide 2 days later. The method, sudden, controlled, possession stripped, echoed the pawnshop killing. She pushed for an interprovincial alert, filing reports that threaded a thin, dark line from Toronto to the forests of northern Ontario. The pair, meanwhile, kept moving, westward through Manitoba's endless plains into Saskatchewan's dry wind. Their crimes blurred into a map of red pins and unanswered questions. On a stretch of prairie highway at dusk, they pulled to the shoulder and watched the sky bleed orange. Elara thought of Halifax only in fragments, a door slamming, her mother's silence, the smell of salt wind. Liam flicked his lighter and grinned, the scar on his jaw catching the fading light. They felt untouchable. Snow drifted across Highway 1 in glittering sheets. 200 kilometers west of Winnipeg, a truck stop waitress named Clara Jensen, 24, was found unconscious behind the cafe where she worked the night shift. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP report recorded serious physical assault, including evidence of sexual violence. Clara survived, but her memory came only in fragments. 2 figures in the dark, one male voice low and steady, the other higher, almost laughing. Detective Susan Carrow, newly seconded to an interprovincial task force, read the report twice. The pattern was emerging: mobility, speed, sudden brutality. 3 weeks later, a freight conductor discovered the frozen body of Anthony Delgado, 30, in an empty rail car. He had been robbed of his wallet and wedding ring. Witnesses recalled a thin man and a pale woman leaving a bar near the rail yard hours earlier, their hair hidden under dark knit caps. Carrow underlined the detail: always a pair, always vanishing before sunrise. The couple drifted west ahead of the blizzard season. They stayed in flophouses and the corners of abandoned barns. Elara kept a notebook of dates and cash totals, the pages smudged with road dust. Their next victim, Marjorie Kent, 19, was found the following morning near the South Saskatchewan River. The coroner's file noted fatal blunt force trauma and, in a single clinical line, sexual assault confirmed. News stations began using the name Ghost Highway Killers, a phrase coined by a Winnipeg talk radio host that soon spread nationwide. Detective Carrow now headed a team of 8. She logged every clue: tire tracks, shoe prints, partial DNA from both Manitoba and Saskatchewan scenes. She pressed for the creation of a cross-province database months before such coordination was standard. Her notes included a recurring description: female suspect appears younger than male, both slender, move with confidence. By February, she had matched DNA from 3 scenes to a composite profile. A male with Eastern Canadian markers. The woman remained a cipher. Near Drumheller, a couple on a winter road trip. Paul and Denise Howarth, both 32, vanished from a campground. Their car was found a day later on a service road, engine still warm. Evidence logs listed robbery and multiple fatal injuries. Their 4-year-old daughter, left with grandparents in Calgary, became the face on every nightly broadcast. By April 1996, Canadian media ran nightly segments tracking the killer's trail across the prairies. Gas station attendants kept shotguns behind counters. Travelers avoided isolated rest stops after dark. The pair, meanwhile, treated headlines like trophies. In a shabby Edmonton motel, Liam traced a map with cigarette ash, marking each province in a slow, satisfied line. Elara watched the evening news, expression unreadable, as their composite sketches flashed across the screen. Detective Carrow worked 18-hour days, coordinating with RCMP detachments and provincial labs. By early May 1996, she finally had a breakthrough. A fingerprint match on a discarded beer bottle from the Drumheller scene. Liam Thorne, age 21. Priors for theft and assault in Ontario. At last there was a name and a face. The Trans-Canada Highway bent through the Rockies in long black ribbons. Freight trucks strained up the grades. The scent of wet pine and diesel drifted across the switchbacks. Liam and Elara guided a maroon sedan they'd lifted outside Calgary, the Alberta plates still warm from another life. The car's trunk rattled with what little they carried: half a bag of clothes, a tire iron streaked with rust, the cash from their last night in Medicine Hat. They stopped only for gas, keeping their heads down while posters with their photographs curled on convenience store windows. The radio stations followed them like a shadow. Each broadcast of the Ghost Highway Killers drew a crooked smile from Liam. Elara just watched the mountains rise. 2 days later they reached Kamloops, a city ringed by sage hills and railroad lines. They prowled the back streets after midnight, drawn to the quiet of the riverside parks. Cameron Frost, 27, was finishing a cross-Canada bike trip when they found him resting near the trailhead. No one heard the struggle over the roar of the river. By morning, a jogger spotted the body, pockets turned out, wallet gone. Investigators marked blunt force trauma and robbery on the initial report. No other detail leaked, only the rising fear that the pair had crossed another province without slowing. In Winnipeg, Detective Susan Carrow gathered her files. Maps dotted with red pins, photos of crime scene tape snapping in prairie wind, and boarded a westbound flight. She had been chasing them for months and knew their pattern: isolated travelers, sudden violence, and a quick exit before anyone could react. By the time her plane touched down in Vancouver, local RCMP detachments had roadblocks planned for Highway 1 and every service station stocked with wanted posters. Liam and Elara skirted Vancouver itself, preferring the smaller towns along the Fraser Valley: Chilliwack, Abbotsford, Mission. They paid cash at rundown motels with flickering neon signs, curtains that never quite closed. Money dwindled. Nights grew restless. Elara wandered outside while Liam studied road maps, their breaths misting in the coastal rain, the Pacific's briny smell mixed with exhaust and wet cedar. By June 20th, the Globe and Mail carried a banner headline: Ghost Highway Pair Believed in British Columbia. Public warned to stay vigilant. Television anchors replayed their mugshots, one grainy, one sharp, between footage of crime scene tents and sobbing families. Call-in shows filled with rumors. They'd shaved their heads, dyed their hair, hidden among fishermen on the coast. Carrow felt the pressure tighten. Every day without an arrest was another chance for the pair to disappear into the endless inlets and logging roads of the province. Rain hammered Highway 7, blurring the lights of distant farmhouses. A pair of RCMP cruisers idled near Mission, their radios murmuring. Detective Carrow rode in the lead vehicle, reviewing the latest dispatch. Possible sighting, maroon sedan, Alberta plates. It was the first credible lead in days. They left a gas station minutes before the alert went out, windshield wipers struggling against the downpour. Elara kept her hood low as Liam steered east toward a warren of logging roads. The car smelled of damp clothes and gasoline. Their last cash, barely $100, sat folded in Elara's jacket pocket. Each mile without headlights felt like stolen time. RCMP set a checkpoint at Dewdney Trunk Road, the only paved route toward the mountains. Officers in slickers and reflective vests braced against the storm, traffic cones glowing in the dark. Carrow scanned each approaching vehicle, pickup, minivan, delivery truck. The maroon sedan never appeared. Liam had spotted the flashing lights miles ahead. He veered onto a gravel spur used by logging crews, tires spitting stones. They bumped along until the highway noise faded. Rainforest closed around them, cedar trunks black with wet, moss hanging like torn fabric. For 2 hours they crept through the maze of service roads, the car's low beams slicing curtains of mist. When the fuel gauge hovered near empty, they parked beneath a canopy of firs and killed the engine. At dawn, Carrow stood beneath a dripping awning outside Mission Detachment, scanning a provincial map. Search teams had combed every paved road, the fugitives had vanished into the wilderness. She jotted in her notebook, "Nose back roads. Will risk secondary routes. Next move, Vancouver Island ferries or south to US border." The longer they stayed hidden, the harder the hunt would become. In the forest, Liam broke open a vending machine stash of peanuts from their last stop. Elara chewed without tasting. They hadn't planned for this long off the grid, but neither suggested turning back. She thought of her mother, of Halifax's salty air, of a childhood that felt like it belonged to someone else. Each memory sharpened her resolve. No surrender, no apology. The fugitives were still out of reach, but the dragnet was closing. RCMP alerts now crossed the US border, and Carrow's task force doubled patrols at every ferry terminal. Rain needled the station windows as Detective Susan Carrow spread 2 heavy folders across the conference table. Elara Voss, Liam Thorne, paper smelled of damp toner and old glue. These were the lives before the headlines, before the string of killings. Carrow believed that in the tangle of family and loss lay the one weakness she could use. Halifax birth records placed her arrival on July 6, 1970. An ordinary childhood, at least on paper. A modest row house near the harbour, a bright little girl who read quickly and wandered the shoreline collecting shells. The fracture came 9 months before she vanished. Margaret Voss, her mother, had moved her boyfriend Grant Willis into the house. Police and social service notes painted a dim picture. Neighbours hearing arguments, an anonymous report of possible abuse, no charges filed. Elara filed the complaints herself, small, careful notations to a school counsellor, each one ending the same way. Mother informed, denies concern. Then, October 1993, Elara walked out and did not return. What struck Carrow most was not Elara's silence, but Margaret's persistence. Phone records showed dozens of unanswered calls placed to old friends, shelters, even faraway boarding houses. Letters went unreturned. By the spring of 1994, guilt had hollowed the mother's resolve. Interviews with neighbours described a night when Margaret opened the front door and told Grant Willis to leave. Voice shaking, suitcase at his feet, after finally admitting she had chosen the wrong side. He never came back. Margaret still lives in that same salt-stained house, curtains drawn against Atlantic storms, a room upstairs preserved exactly as the day Elara left. Her teenage son, Noah, now 16, helps with groceries and keeps his mother's garden neat. The second folder held only absence. Born March 18, 1971, Winnipeg. Father dead of a heroin overdose when Liam was 15. Mother gone 3 years later, fentanyl-laced pills. No grandparents, no uncles. Foster care, group homes, short stints in juvenile detention filled the remainder. Car theft, assault, a few months in Stony Mountain. The case files described a boy who learned to leave before anyone else could. No one left to call, no door to knock on. Carrow closed the folders and pressed her palms flat on the cool table. 2 fugitives, one with a single fragile tether across the country, one with none. Elara can still be reached, Carrow thought, not because she calls, but because someone waits. The plan took shape. Discreet RCMP liaison with Margaret and Noah, round-the-clock observation, no public leaks. If the fugitives sensed the pull of family, if Elara faltered, It would be through the mother who never stopped searching. Half a continent away, Margaret Voss kept vigil. She had driven Grant Willis from the house 2 years ago, the night she could no longer stand the echo of her daughter's last words. She still sets a place at the kitchen table on Elara's birthday. Neighbors glimpse her in the evenings on the porch, staring down the quiet street. When the RCMP liaison arrived unannounced with photographs and careful questions, Margaret offered tea with trembling hands. "I will do whatever helps," she said softly. "I don't know where she is." But I never stopped looking. Carrow underlined a single phrase in her notebook before leaving the conference room. "Family is the thread. Pull it carefully." The stolen Ford pickup rumbled until its engine finally clicked into silence beneath a sky salted with stars. Heat from the long drive bled into the cool night. Liam cut the headlights and let the dark swallow the fields. He killed the ignition and listened, only the wind rasping through endless wheat. They had taken the truck 12 hours earlier on the western edge of Winnipeg, an impulsive grab from a grocery store parking lot. The owner, a middle-aged man named Harold Keyes, 53, had gone inside for milk. Liam jimmied the door while Elara kept watch, her eyes following the man through the glass like a hawk. They left his wallet and his house keys in the glove compartment out of habitless courtesy, but the vehicle was theirs before Harold had reached the checkout. Now, miles of dirt road later, they had outpaced the city's reach. The sky was deep indigo, the land so flat it seemed the earth itself was holding its breath. Liam stretched across the truck bed, boots dangling over the tailgate. Elara slid beside him, the smell of gasoline and dry grain settling into their clothes. They were dusted with road grit and fatigue, but the emptiness around them felt like freedom. A whippoorwill called once, then silence again. Neither spoke. They rarely needed to. Months on the run had fused them into something wordless, two halves of a pulse. They shared a single cigarette, the ember rising like a tiny flare against the black. Elara's mind drifted in slow circles. She thought of the cities sliding behind them, Edmonton's neon alleys, the sagging motels near Saskatoon, the last gas station where they had siphoned fuel while the attendant slept. They had left a trail of theft and sudden violence across the map. Cash registers ripped open, travelers bludgeoned for their cars, a pair of campers in Jasper still missing after a midnight encounter. Each act blurred into the next, a collage of headlights, blood, and quick escape. Liam watched the sky, counting constellations he could never name. He imagined the headlines that might be chasing them by now, and felt only a slow, rising pleasure. Every province they crossed without capture was another dare thrown at the world. Hours passed like that. The wheat whispered. The cigarette burned to a stub. The night cooled until dew settled on the truck's steel skin. Hundreds of miles east, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police worked by lamplight. Detective Susan Carrow stood over a fresh provincial map, its surface crowded with pins and looping strings. Margaret Voss had agreed, quietly and without hesitation, to keep her phone line open and to record every call. Noah, her teenage son, had been briefed to remain calm if his sister ever appeared. A separate team combed rental car records and service station cameras across Manitoba and Saskatchewan, comparing grainy footage to the fugitives' photographs. Another detective, Alan Brisebois, a veteran of rural patrols, coordinated checkpoints along the Trans-Canada Highway. The plan was patient and deliberate. Tighten the circle without warning. Let the fugitives believe distance meant safety. Carrow reread the most recent witness statement. Someone in Brandon had seen a man and woman siphoning gas from a pickup late the previous evening. The description fit. A call went out to detachments westward. Quiet orders followed. No sirens, no headlines. Watch and wait. Just before dawn, a low mist settled over the fields. Liam rolled onto his side and rested a hand across Elara's stomach, feeling the steady rhythm of her breath. She remained half asleep, face turned to the rising pale light. The engine ticked as it cooled. They would wake soon, he thought, and drive again, perhaps toward Calgary, perhaps straight through to the Rockies. Towns and names no longer mattered. Only the open road and the chase. Somewhere beyond that horizon, though they could not sense it, the slow machinery of pursuit was already moving, quiet and sure as the tide. The mountains rose out of the plains like black teeth against the evening sky. After 2 days of prairie roads, the sudden wall of jagged stone felt almost alive, an ancient barricade that should have warned them back. But Liam only grinned at the sharp switchbacks as the stolen Ford climbed higher into the dark. They had left Saskatchewan before sunrise, fueled by coffee stolen from an all-night diner and a handful of pastries stuffed into Liam's jacket. The highway narrowed, traffic thinning until only the occasional transport truck roared past in a gust of diesel. Elara leaned her head against the window, breath fogging the glass. Every mile west made her feel lighter, as if the flatlands behind them could no longer hold her name. Yet the tension between them was electric. They were past caution now. The radio spilled bulletins about an armed pair wanted in connection with multiple violent robberies across Manitoba. The words carried no weight, only a distant thrill. At a rest stop outside Medicine Hat, they had lifted a carton of cigarettes from an unattended sedan. The owner, a woman in her 50s, had stepped out of the washroom in time to see them drive away. Liam had caught her eyes in the side mirror, a flash of panic in the dusk, then nothing. Hundreds of kilometers behind, Detective Susan Carrow marked their probable route in red ink. The Brandon gas theft witness had provided a rough timestamp. Cameras along the Trans-Canada outside Regina captured a blurred pickup with a plate half torn away. "Headed west," said Alan Brisebois, his finger tracing the map through Calgary toward the Rockies. "If they keep the speed we've seen, they'll be near Canmore tonight." Carrow ordered quiet coordination with Alberta detachments, plainclothes patrols, no sirens, no roadblocks to spook them. The Halifax team maintained nightly contact with Margaret Voss, whose voice trembled each time she answered, but never faltered. Every update deepened Carrow's conviction. Family will bring them in, not force. But she also sensed the risk. Each day on the road meant more chance of another random killing. Night pressed hard as they wound into Banff National Park. Pockets of mist glowed in the truck's headlights. They turned off onto a narrow service road and finally stopped where a creek cut through tall pines. The air smelled of cold water and resin. Liam jumped from the cab and stretched, muscles stiff from hours of driving. Elara followed, boots crunching on gravel. They stood side by side, silent, staring at the rushing creek. The water's sound masked the world. She thought of the campers in Jasper 2 weeks earlier, faces she tried not to recall, a scene buried but never gone. Liam's hand found hers, calloused and warm. He smiled faintly, a look of private amusement, as if the memory were a shared secret no one could touch. They ate cold bread and dried fruit taken from a roadside market, then lay on their jackets beneath the trees. The stars here were knife-bright, the Milky Way a ghostly river above them. Exhaustion blurred their senses until the forest seemed to breathe with them. Somewhere beyond the timberline, unmarked cars drifted along the highway shoulders, radios whispering updates. But in this hollow of night, the couple slept as if the world had already ended. The stolen truck cooling beside them, dew forming on the hood. Mist hung in the pines like pale smoke. The stolen Ford pickup sat half-hidden under a stand of spruce, its metal skin beaded with dew. Liam and Elara slept in the truck bed beneath a blanket of roadside jackets, their breathing slow, matched to the whisper of the creek. Down the service road, 2 RCMP cruisers rolled in silence. Their headlights were killed, their tires barely whispering over gravel. Constable Eric Blanchard drove the lead vehicle, night vision binoculars balanced against the dashboard. A report from a Banff gas station attendant had brought them here, an old pickup with a partial plate, matching the fugitive's stolen Manitoba truck. The attendant had seen it veer toward this access road an hour earlier. Blanchard's partner, Constable Marie Cho, scanned the woods. "Could be campers," she murmured, voice barely above the hum of the engine. "Or them," Blanchard said. He eased the car to a stop, both officers stepping into the cold. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Cho swung her flashlight in a low arc, catching only needles and fog. Somewhere far off, an owl called once and went quiet. 30 yards away, the Ford sat in darkness. The officers could see only the curve of the tailgate through the trees. No movement. Blanchard motioned forward, one palm raised. Wait, they listened for voices, a A cough, the scrape of a boot. Nothing but the creak. Cho whispered into her shoulder mic, requesting a silent perimeter team. Static answered, signal weak under the mountain. Minutes passed, the cold crept into their gloves. Liam stirred. A faint crunch of gravel teased the edge of his sleep. He opened one eye, pupils adjusting to the dim starlight. Beside him, Elara exhaled, shifting beneath the jackets. He held his breath. Another sound, soft, deliberate, like a branch bending under weight. Not animal, too measured. He nudged Elara with the lightest touch. Her eyes opened instantly, dark and alert. They listened together, muscles locked. A sudden crack echoed, startlingly close. Blanchard swung his light toward the noise. A mule deer leapt from the brush, hooves splashing through the creek. The animal bounded into the dark, breaking branches like gunfire. Cho let out the breath she'd been holding. "Just wildlife," she whispered. Blanchard lowered the light but scanned again, uneasy. He thumbed his radio, finally catching a burst of static-laced confirmation from perimeter units. Negative contact, no vehicles. Protocol held. With no certain visual and no signal strong enough for backup, they couldn't risk a blind approach on suspected armed killers. Blanchard gave a slow shake of his head. "We'll circle back at dawn," he said quietly. They retreated, footsteps swallowed by fog. The forest stilled once more. Liam kept his hand on Elara's wrist until the faint crunch of tires faded down the service road. He listened for another minute, heart pounding. Nothing. He leaned close enough for a whisper only she could hear. "Not animals," he breathed. She nodded once. Their shared silence carried both relief and a rising thrill, the narrowest of escapes. They lay back beneath the damp canopy, adrenaline slowly ebbing, the stars above cold and indifferent. By the time the RCMP cruisers reached the highway, the fugitives were already plotting their next move. Though neither would remember, come morning, how close the law had passed. Rain swept across the windows of the Halifax RCMP headquarters as Detective Susan Carrow read the Banff field report for the third time. 2 officers had passed within 50 yards of the fugitives while they slept, and still the pair had slipped away. Frustration burned, but the near miss proved something crucial. Liam Thorne and Elara Voss were not untouchable. They stopped to eat, they stopped to sleep, and if they stopped, they could be caught. Carrow lifted the phone and dialed the number she now knew by heart. Margaret Voss answered on the first ring, her voice steady only with effort. Carrow told her what mattered, that her daughter and the man beside her were alive, that they were moving east, that if Elara reached out again, she must keep her on the line and speak only of forgiveness and the wish to see her. Margaret paused, then said quietly, "I will. Whatever it takes." While the RCMP mapped probable routes, the fugitives were already steering back across the country. The Rockies had begun to feel like a cage. They craved distance, motion, risk. A Calgary headline, "RCMP Intensify Hunt for Prairie Killers," made Liam laugh but nudged him toward the long road east. The weeks that followed left a trail of blood and grainy surveillance. On the 2nd of September 1996, in Regina, they robbed a liquor store and left cashier Harold Keyes, 53, beaten but alive on the tile floor. 2 weeks later, 14 September, outside Thunder Bay, they hijacked a midnight blue sedan from college couple Ryan Coates, 21, and Kendra Miles, 22, binding them with their own seatbelts and vanishing into the dark. At the end of the month, 28th September, deep in the Ottawa Valley, they broke into the lakeside cabin of Victor Leclerc, 58. When Leclerc surprised them in the kitchen, Liam struck without hesitation. The man died before he could cry out. Each act left a sharper trail, blurry faces caught on gas station cameras, a string of half-burned fingerprints, credit card tips whispered to police. Still the pair moved east, lean on cash and thick with adrenaline. On the first night of October, long after the neighborhood slept, Margaret Voss answered a ringing phone. A soft click, then a breath. "Mom." The single word carried 3 fugitive years inside it. Elara's voice, older, roughened, but hers. Margaret's fingers tightened on the receiver until her knuckles ached. "Elara," she said, steady as she could, "I'm here." There was no conversation, only a few spare assurances. She was fine, she was out east. And then the line went dead. Margaret sat in the dim kitchen for a long time, the dial tone humming like a heartbeat, before calling the number Detective Carrow had given her. By dawn, the RCMP's quiet machinery was in motion. Teams from 3 provinces slipped into place, unmarked cars posted along ferry routes, plainclothes officers waiting at highway rest areas, checkpoints disguised as construction crews. Microphones were hidden in Margaret's house, and Noah, the teenage son who had never stopped scanning every passing face for his sister, was briefed on what to say if she appeared. Carrow moved through the preparations with the cold precision of a surgeon. Family, she thought, not force, would bring Elara in. Far to the west, Liam guided their newest stolen sedan along a ribbon of 2-lane road through the Maritimes. Autumn had set the trees ablaze in scarlet and gold. Wood smoke threaded the evening air. They had no clear destination, only a restless tug eastward that neither of them named. Elara stared out at the turning leaves, something tightening in her chest with each passing kilometre. The land smelled of salt and memory. She said nothing about the brief call she had made from a payphone 3 nights earlier, a sudden need to hear her mother's voice after years of silence. Liam sensed the change in her, but kept his hand steady on the wheel. The sedan rolled on toward Halifax, the net stretched wide and invisible ahead. The rain off the Atlantic came in sheets that blurred the harbour lights, a constant hiss against the windshield of the unmarked sedan. Detective Susan Carrow kept the engine running low, the heater set to defog. Beside her, Corporal André Pelletier watched the quiet street where Margaret Voss's narrow house leaned into the storm. Midnight slid toward 1 a.m. 3 nights earlier, Elara Voss had phoned her mother again. This time she'd spoken longer, long enough for a trace. The call had come from a payphone in Dartmouth, across the water, and ended with a promise that she might come home soon. It was enough. RCMP teams shifted into position across the Halifax Peninsula, plain sedans tucked among late-night traffic, ferry terminals watched, every highway exit shadowed. Inside the house, Margaret sat with her son Noah on the living room sofa, the lamps low. A microphone hidden beneath the coffee table carried every sound to the vans outside. Margaret's hands rested on her knees, still except for the slow curl of her fingers. Far away along Route 102, a stolen silver sedan cut through the darkness. Liam Thorne, now 27, had been driving for hours, the lines of the road strobing across the hood. Elara, 25, lay reclined in the passenger seat, awake, silent. The Maritimes smelled of wet pine and cold salt. Halifax felt close. She didn't tell Liam that she'd called again, only murmured that she wanted to see the ocean before they disappeared inland. By 2 a.m., the sedan slipped off the highway and into the sleeping city. Cameras caught the license plate as they crossed the McDonald Bridge. Data fed instantly to the RCMP command post. Carrow's phone vibrated. "They're here." The trap tightened without sound. Units at the ferry docks sealed the exits. Another team closed the bridge span. Carrow and Pelletier eased from the sedan and crossed the slick pavement to Margaret's porch. Minutes later, tires hissed to a stop a block away. Liam idled the car under a dripping elm. Elara studied the familiar street, the faint yellow glow behind her mother's curtains. A lifetime pressed behind that glass. Rain ticked on the roof like a slow clock. "They watching?" Liam asked. He kept his voice low, the edge of a grin on it. "Feels like it." Elara didn't answer. She opened the door and stepped into the rain. The first shout came as her foot touched the porch. "Elara Voss, Liam Thorne, RCMP, hands where we can see them." Lights exploded from the darkness, white, blue, red, washing the street in a trembling glow. Liam spun toward the sound, hand darting toward the pocket where a knife rested. But a red dot burned across his chest before he could move again. Carrow's voice cut through the storm. "Don't." "It's over." For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Rain streamed down Elara's face, salt and water together. She lowered her hands. Liam's eyes met hers, an unspoken question, then he raised his arms as well. Officers surged forward. Cold steel circled wrists, plastic bindings snapped. The two were guided separately down the wet steps toward waiting cars. Margaret remained inside, a silhouette behind the curtains, shoulders shaking in silence. As the cruisers pulled away, Carrow exhaled for the first time in hours. 3 years of running had ended, not with a shootout, but with the soft click of rain on asphalt. The heavy oak doors closed, and the sound of the latch echoed through the Halifax Supreme Court. The gallery hushed. Rain rattled faintly against the high windows, but inside the chamber the air was warm and close, every cough or scrape of a shoe magnified beneath the high plaster ceiling. Justice Irene McAllister sat at the bench, black robes pooling like dark water, silver hair braided and pinned. "Court is now in session," the clerk announced, and all rose as the judge's gavel struck once, a single commanding report. 2 deputies led the accused into view. Elara Voss, 25, walked first, shackled at wrists and ankles, the chain at her waist barely stirring the orange fabric of her prison suit. Behind her came Liam Thorne, 27, his shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. They did not look at one another. The gallery was packed, reporters with notepads poised, camera lenses lowered in deference to the judge's earlier order, families of the dead seated stiffly in the front rows. Margaret Voss sat beside her teenage son Noah, a black coat wrapped around her like armor. Across the aisle, relatives of victims held photographs against their chests. Faces of Ryan Coates, 21, and Kendra Miles, 22, taken on a summer day that would be their last. A framed picture of Victor Leclerc, 58, smiling from the deck of his lake cabin, and a smaller snapshot of Harold Keyes, 53, the liquor store clerk who survived but would never walk without pain again. The Crown Prosecutor, Daniel Herrick, rose. His voice was measured but relentless as he began the opening statement. He laid out the chronology. The first confirmed killing in May 1994, the hijackings and murders that spanned Saskatchewan, Ontario, and the Maritimes, and the final arrest outside this very city in October 1996. Herrick named each victim, recited the dates, and described the forensic evidence that stitched the trail together. DNA lifted from cigarette filters, fingerprints preserved in the seams of a burned-out sedan, witnesses who remembered a couple laughing as they bought gas hours after a killing. Across the defense table, Miriam Colville waited her turn, hands folded on a stack of notes. When she rose, her voice carried no apology, only an appeal for comprehension. She spoke of Elara's years of abuse in her mother's house, of Liam's childhood shaped by foster homes after both parents died of overdoses. "You are not asked to forgive," she told the jury, "but to understand the lives that led to this courtroom." Throughout, Elara kept her eyes lowered, a pale profile against the courtroom's dark wood. Liam shifted often, watching the jurors one by one, the faintest trace of a smile when Herrick described the manhunt that had crossed provinces and years. When the gavel finally struck to signal the first recess, no one moved at first. The spectators remained frozen, as if the weight of the crimes, dates, names, ages, had settled like a physical pressure over the room. Only when the deputies began to guide the defendants away did the murmur return, a low tide of breath and whispers, the storm outside answering with a dull, relentless drum. The bailiff's call, "All rise," rolled across the room like a slow wave. Chairs scraped the polished floor as everyone stood. Justice Irene McAllister entered from her chambers and settled behind the high bench, a single nod releasing the room back into their seats. The second day of Regina versus Voss and Thorne had begun. The Crown Prosecutor, Daniel Herrick, rose first, a sheaf of crisp notes in his hand. "The people call Detective Susan Carrow," he said. A tall woman in a navy suit stepped to the witness stand. Carrow's calm was practiced. 3 years of pursuit had hardened her voice. After the clerk administered the oath, Herrick began to build the case, brick by brick. Carrow described the first known homicide, Victor Leclerc, 58, found on the 28th of September 1996 in his lakeside cabin near Ottawa, his throat cut. She spoke of the matching tire tracks and the cigarette filter bearing Liam Thorne's DNA. Herrick guided her through each subsequent step. The hijacked sedan near Thunder Bay, the discovery of Ryan Coates, 21, and Kendra Miles, 22, bound with their own seatbelts, the liquor store robbery in Regina where Harold Keyes, 53, barely survived a fractured skull. Maps were displayed on a tall easel, Saskatchewan to Ontario to Nova Scotia, each crime marked in red. Jurors leaned forward as Carrow pointed to the dotted lines of the fugitive's route. She explained how each police jurisdiction had passed the investigation forward until the final night in Halifax, when a phone trace from Elara's call to her mother allowed the RCMP to set the trap. The defense remained still. When their turn came, Miriam Colville's questions were brief, aimed not at discrediting Carrow, but at tracing the human thread. "Detective," she asked quietly, "when you spoke to Ms. Voss's mother that night, did she ever waver in her wish for her daughter's safe return?" Carrow admitted she had not. Next came the forensic pathologist, Dr. Aaron Greaves. His testimony was clinical and cold. The depth of knife wounds, the pattern of blunt force trauma, the clear evidence that each victim died within minutes. Photographs, sanitized yet unflinching, were entered into evidence. The gallery held its breath. A few relatives turned their faces away. Margaret Voss closed her eyes but did not move. After a recess, Herrick called a witness who shifted the courtroom's temperature. Harold Keyes, now 55, walking carefully with a cane. He told how, on the 2nd of September 1996, he had looked up from the till to see the couple step into his store. How the man's fist arrived before he could speak. How the world had gone white with pain. His voice cracked only once, when he said he awoke hours later to the sound of his own breathing and the realization that he was alone. Elara sat motionless, gaze fixed on the table before her. Liam's expression did not change. By late afternoon, the rain outside had thinned to mist. Justice McAllister dismissed the jury until morning. The gallery emptied in a slow, solemn tide, the weight of testimony hanging heavy as the scent of varnish and old paper. The evidence had begun its patient work, dates and wounds, maps and voices layering into an unshakable picture of the hunt and the harm left behind. The clerk's call echoed through the Halifax Supreme Court once more. "All rise." Chairs rasped against wood as the jurors returned, faces tight with the weight of yesterday's testimony. Morning light filtered through tall windows, pale against the dark oak. Justice Irene McAllister gave a single nod. "The court will come to order." Harold Keyes, now 55, remained on the witness stand. His cane rested across his knees, a thin tremor visible in his right hand. Defense attorney Miriam Colville approached with deliberate calm, her voice measured. "Mr. Keyes," she began, "you testified yesterday that you were struck almost immediately. Did you ever clearly see the woman who accompanied Mr. Thorne?" Keyes's gaze settled on the defense table. "I saw her," he said, voice rough but steady. "She stood by the door. Didn't speak, but I saw her." "You cannot say you saw her commit an act of violence?" "No," he admitted, "but she watched." Colville paused, letting the silence stretch. "And you were unconscious when the store was ransacked?" "Yes." She asked nothing further. The subtle implication that Elara might not have raised her hand hung for a moment before Crown Prosecutor Daniel Herrick rose for redirect. "Mr. Keyes," Herrick said, "when you awoke, were you alone?" "Yes." "And was the cash register emptied?" "All of it," Keyes confirmed, fingers tightening on the cane. The jury's eyes followed him as he stepped down, each slow movement a testament to injuries that had never fully healed. Herrick next called Marianne Coates, older sister of Ryan Coates, 21, killed with Kendra Miles, 22, near Thunder Bay. She clutched a framed photograph of her brother, the glass smudged from her grip. Her voice shook but did not break as she described the last phone call. Ryan laughing about the long road trip, promising to be home by the weekend. She told of the night police arrived, the sterile room where she identified his body. When asked to describe the impact, she looked directly at the jury. "My brother was 21. He'd just been accepted to graduate school. They tied him up like garbage and left him in a ditch. There is no sentence long enough for that." Behind her, Kendra Miles's parents held hands so tightly their knuckles whitened. Herrick guided them gently through their testimony, the frantic days of searching, the quiet devastation of loss. The courtroom absorbed every word, the jurors' expressions taut, a few audience members wiping silent tears. Colville did not cross-examine the grieving families. She remained seated, pen still, a small acknowledgement that some statements required no challenge. Finally, Herrick called Detective André Pelletier, part of the Halifax arrest team. He narrated the final stakeout, the traced call from a Dartmouth payphone, the silent approach to Margaret Voss's house, the sudden flood of lights and commands. He described Elara stepping from the stolen sedan first, Liam a step behind, both surrendering under the cold rain. Throughout the morning, Elara kept her gaze lowered to the polished table. Liam watched each witness with a fixed half-smile, as though the words were a puzzle only he understood. When Justice McAllister recessed for the midday break, the gallery exhaled as one. The jurors filed out slowly, their faces marked by the gravity of testimony. The voices of the living had filled the chamber, each account another stone laid in the path toward judgment. The bailiff's call settled over the Halifax Supreme Court like a bell of iron. By the third week of testimony, the jurors had grown pale with fatigue, but every seat in the gallery remained full. Rain streaked the tall windows, a low Atlantic wind hummed against the stone. Defense counsel Miriam Colville rose first. Her suit was the same charcoal grey she had worn since opening arguments, her voice calm but carrying. "The defense calls Dr. Evelyn Rourke," she said. A woman in her early 50s approached the stand, silver-streaked hair pulled into a knot. After the oath, Colville began. "Dr. Rourke, please state your field." "Clinical psychology. I specialize in trauma and adolescent development." Colville led the doctor through years of records and interviews. Rourke spoke of Liam Thorne's childhood. Both parents dead from heroin overdoses when he was 12. Years in foster care, punctuated by temporary placements and frequent disappearances. He experienced chronic instability, she explained. By adolescence, he demonstrated the classic markers of attachment disorder: hypervigilance, impulsivity, an inability to trust. Prosecutor Daniel Herrick rose to object when Colville ventured near the line of excuse, but Justice Irene McAllister allowed the testimony. "The jury," she said, "may hear the background and weigh it as they see fit." Next came a social worker who had known Liam during his years in the system. He described a boy who vanished for days, returned hungry and silent, and once slept in an abandoned rail car through a January storm. He was clever, the man admitted, but he never believed anyone would keep him. Colville then shifted the focus. "The defense calls Margaret Voss." The gallery stirred. Margaret walked steadily to the stand, dark coat buttoned to her throat. She took the oath, her voice no louder than a whisper. Colville's questions were gentle. Margaret spoke of raising Elara alone after her husband's death, of falling for a man named Carl who moved in when Elara was 16. "It changed," Margaret said. "He changed." Angry. Controlling her voice wavered. "Elara came to me. She said he hurt her. She stopped, swallowed. "I didn't believe her." Not soon enough. She described the night she found the bedroom door locked, her daughter gone, a note scrawled on lined paper. "I can't stay. Don't look for me." Months later she forced Carl to leave, but the damage was done. "I waited by the phone for years," Margaret said, eyes shining. "When she finally called, I told her to come home. I would have done anything." Herrick approached for cross-examination, his voice even. "Mrs. Voss, do you believe your daughter's childhood excuses the murders she stands accused of?" Margaret met his gaze. "No, nothing excuses them. But I want you to know she wasn't born a monster." The courtroom held its breath. Even the rain outside seemed to pause. Colville concluded with one final witness, a forensic psychiatrist who spoke of the pair's mutual reinforcement of deviance. How two wounded young adults found in each other the validation for every violent urge. Together, the doctor said, they became a closed circuit. Each impulse amplified. When the defense rested, hours of testimony lay behind them: lost parents, foster homes, an ignored cry for help. The jurors sat motionless, faces pale in the late afternoon light. No one in the room mistook these stories for absolution, but they deepened the shadows that shaped the two figures at the defense table. Elara kept her eyes on her folded hands. Liam stared at the ceiling, expression unreadable, as the judge called for recess and the heavy gavel echoed through the chamber. The Halifax Supreme Court was silent as the jurors filed back into the box for the last time before deliberations. Morning light slanted through tall windows, throwing pale rectangles across the dark wood. Everyone in the gallery rose when Justice Irene McAllister entered. She gave a single nod, and the room sat as one. Crown Prosecutor Daniel Herrick stood first. He walked to the center of the well and let the silence settle before he began. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, voice low but carrying. "For 3 years, Liam Thorne and Elara Voss crisscrossed this country, leaving a trail of bodies. These are not disputed facts. You have heard the dates, the names, the ages. Victor Leclerc, 58, murdered in his own cabin. Ryan Coates, 21, and Kendra Miles, 22, bound and left to die near Thunder Bay. The near-fatal assault on Harold Keyes, 53. You have seen the maps, the DNA reports, the photographs that none of us will forget." Herrick paused, letting the jurors' eyes meet his. "You also heard their story of childhood pain. Do not confuse hardship with destiny. Many endure suffering without killing. What these defendants chose was pleasure in cruelty. The evidence shows planning, movement across provinces, a deliberate hunt. We ask you to return a verdict of guilty on every count." He returned to the Crown's table, papers untouched. Defense counsel Miriam Colville rose slowly, a single legal pad in hand. Her voice was quiet but steady. "No one disputes the deaths," she began. "No one asks you to forgive. But you have heard of a boy who lost both parents to heroin by 12. A girl who begged her mother for help against an abusive man and was not believed. 2 young people shaped by neglect and violence found each other and created a world where pain was currency. I am not asking you to release them. I am asking you to see the full human picture before you decide the measure of their punishment. Choose justice, not vengeance." She lowered her notes and looked at each juror in turn. "Remember, understanding is not the same as excusing." When she sat, the room held a taut stillness, broken only by the creak of benches. Justice McAllister's voice followed, calm and precise, instructing the jury on each charge. 3 counts of first-degree murder, 2 of aggravated assault, multiple counts of armed robbery. She reminded them that the law required proof beyond a reasonable doubt and that sympathy could not replace evidence. The bailiff swore them in and led the 12 jurors through the side door. The latch clicked shut. A hush descended, heavy and expectant. Hours stretched. Rain thickened outside, drumming against the stone. Reporters whispered in the gallery. Family members sat rigid, their faces carved from patience and grief. Elara remained motionless at the defense table, eyes fixed on her folded hands. Liam leaned back slightly, gaze wandering toward the ceiling as though the verdict were already known to him. By evening, the jurors had not returned. Justice McAllister ordered them sequestered and adjourned for the night. As deputies led the defendants away, the sound of chains against tile echoed in the cavernous hall. The wait for judgment had begun. Morning broke cold and colorless over Halifax. A thin mist clung to the courthouse steps where reporters gathered, breath rising in the damp air. Inside, the great chamber stood hushed. The jurors had deliberated through the night and sent word at dawn. They had reached a verdict. The bailiff's command, "All rise," echoed off the high plaster ceiling. Justice Irene McAllister entered and took her seat. Her expression revealed nothing. Deputies led Elara Voss, 25, and Liam Thorne, 27, to the defense table. Chains at their wrists and ankles clinked softly as they sat. Elara kept her gaze on the polished wood before her. Liam's eyes moved across the gallery with a faint, defiant tilt of his head. Families of the victims filled the first rows. Marianne Coates clutched a worn photograph of her brother Ryan, 21. Beside her, the parents of Kendra Miles, 22, held hands tightly. Victor Leclerc's brother sat rigid, jaw clenched. Behind them, Harold Keyes, 53, leaned on his cane, the scar along his temple pale beneath the lights. Margaret Voss sat quietly with her son Noah, her coat buttoned high, face set in a calm no one believed. The side door opened and the jurors filed in, 12 faces pale from sleepless hours. They took their seats, the scrape of chairs the only sound. Justice McAllister addressed the foreperson. "Have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The clerk took the folded paper and read aloud, each word deliberate. "On the charge of first-degree murder of Victor Leclerc, age 58, we find the defendant Liam Thorne guilty. We find the defendant Elara Voss guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder of Ryan Coates, age 21, we find the defendant Liam Thorne guilty. We find the defendant Elara Voss guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder of Kendra Miles, age 22, we find the defendant Liam Thorne guilty. We find the defendant Elara Voss guilty. On the charge of aggravated assault upon Harold Keyes, age 53, we find both defendants guilty. On the charges of armed robbery across multiple provinces, we find both defendants guilty." Each word settled over the room like a stone dropped in water. The families of the dead closed their eyes, some gripping hands, some weeping silently. Elara remained perfectly still, her profile pale and expressionless. Liam let out a slow breath, the faintest curl of a smile at one corner of his mouth. Justice McAllister allowed the silence to lengthen before speaking. Her voice was measured, unwavering. These crimes were brutal, calculated, and sustained over years. The law of this province and this country leaves no ambiguity. She pronounced sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 25 years for each count of first-degree murder, to be served concurrently. Additional years were added for the assault and robberies, though they mattered little against the life terms. The gavel struck once, sharp as a rifle crack. "Court is adjourned." The deputies stepped forward. Liam rose first, chains clinking, his gaze sweeping the gallery as if to memorize the faces. Elara followed, her eyes fixed on the floor, shoulders squared but trembling almost imperceptibly. As they were led through the side door, the families of the victims remained seated, holding photographs close, their long vigil finally answered. Margaret Voss stayed where she was, Noah's hand in hers, a quiet grief softening her features. Outside, rain fell again, washing the courthouse steps clean. The doors closed, the echoes faded, and the long pursuit of Liam Thorne and Elara Voss ended not with flight or gunfire, but with the measured finality of a verdict spoken into still air.